The prairie stretched endlessly under a sky bleached white by the merciless sun, a vast expanse of drought-hardened clay and brittle grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Heat shimmered in waves above the earth, distorting the horizon into a liquid mirage. In the distance, perhaps 200 yards out, a freight wagon sat canted at an unnatural angle, its silhouette dark against the pale emptiness. One wheel had snapped clean off, leaving the axle gouged deep into the cracked ground. The main draft horses were gone. Cut loose in panic or stolen, it was impossible to tell from here. Chayton pulled his roan gelding to a halt and sat motionless in the saddle, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene with the patient wariness of a man who had survived by reading danger in stillness. He was 30 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His hair hung long and black past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and he wore buckskin trousers darkened with trail dust, a cotton shirt faded to the color of old bone, and moccasins stitched from elk hide. Across his lap rested a Henry rifle, its brass receiver dull with use, 16 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. He had been a scout once working for the Army in the years after the treaties broke down, guiding patrols through territory that belonged to no one and everyone. That work had taught him to watch, to wait to see the things that others missed. And what he saw now made his jaw tighten. Circling the wagon at a distance of 70, maybe 80 yards, were coyotes. 5 of them lean and low-bellied, moving in that patient looping pattern that meant they had scented something dying or already dead. Their eyes were fixed on the wreckage, and they tested the air with each pass inching closer, with the confidence of predators who knew their prey could not run. Chayton touched his heels lightly to the roan's ribs and moved forward at a walk slow enough not to spook whatever waited at the wagon, but fast enough to place himself between the coyotes and their target. The roan's hooves crunched softly on the dry earth, and the sound seemed loud in the vast silence. As he drew nearer, he saw movement, a small shape pressed against the side of a bay pony still tethered to the wagon's tailgate. A child. She was a girl no more than 8 years old, barefoot and covered in dust. Her dress, once blue, now stained gray-brown with dirt and sweat, hung torn at the hem, and her hair was matted against her skull. She clung to the pony's neck with both arms, her face buried in its mane, as if the animal were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to smoke. Chayton's chest tightened. He had seen children on the frontier before working beside their parents on homesteads playing in the dirt, outside sod houses, sometimes lying still in graves, marked only by stones. But this one was alone, and the coyotes were closing in. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground without sound, and moved around the front of his horse. He positioned his body between the girl and the nearest coyote, which had crept to within 50 yards. The animal stopped when it saw him, its ears flattening, but it did not retreat. It watched with yellow eyes, calculating. "Easy now," Chayton said, his voice low and steady. He was not entirely sure if he was speaking to the girl, the pony, or the coyotes. Perhaps all 3. "Nobody's getting hurt here." The girl lifted her head slowly, as if the effort cost her everything. Her face was streaked with tear tracks through the dust, and her eyes, wide and blue and hollow, stared at him without recognition or hope. She had cried herself dry hours ago, he realized. Now she was beyond tears, caught in that numb space where fear and exhaustion met. Chayton pulled the canteen from his saddle and uncorked it with his teeth. He held it out toward her, still keeping his body angled to watch the coyotes. "Water," he said. "You need to drink." Under the territory's prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right private tampering with the common ditch, and intake is theft of water and actionable. She did not move. Her lips were cracked and peeling, her tongue too swollen to speak. "Come on, little one," Chayton said, taking a step closer. "Stay behind me. I won't let them near you." For a long moment, she remained frozen. Then slowly, as if moving through deep water, she loosened her grip on the pony's neck and took a single trembling step forward. Her legs buckled, and Chayton moved quickly, catching her by the shoulders and lowering her gently to the ground. He crouched beside her, bringing himself to her level, and offered the canteen again. This time she took it with both hands, small hands blistered and raw, and drank in desperate gulps. "Easy," Chayton murmured, tilting the canteen back to slow her. "Not too fast or you'll be sick." She coughed water dribbling down her chin and then looked up at him with those enormous eyes. "My name is Sophia," she whispered, her voice like wind through dry reeds. "My mama won't wake up." The words hit Chayton harder than he expected. He glanced past her to the wagon where a canvas tarp was draped over the bed, covering something or someone. He handed Sophia the canteen again and stood his joints, protesting the motion. The sun beat down on his back as he walked to the rear of the wagon and lifted the edge of the tarp. The woman lay on her side, curled into herself, one hand still clutching a bundle of cloth. Her skin was the gray of old ashes, her lips blue, her eyes half open and filmed with dust. Chayton did not need to check for breath. He had seen death enough times to recognize its stillness. Dehydration, perhaps, or fever that had burned too hot for too long, or an injury gone septic. It no longer mattered. Above, vultures circled in slow, lazy spirals, their shadows sweeping across the ground like omens. He let the tarp fall back into place and returned to Sophia. She was watching him, her small body rigid, with the knowledge she did not want confirmed. "We have to go," Chayton said, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "Right now." Sophia's face crumpled, and for a moment he thought she would cry. But instead she nodded, swallowing hard, and reached up to take his hand. Her fingers were cold despite the heat. Chayton moved quickly now, efficiency born of necessity. He lifted Sophia onto his roan, settling her in front of the saddle horn where he could keep one arm around her. Then he untied the bay pony's lead rope and secured it to his own saddle. The wagon itself was beyond saving with the wheel gone, but he pulled a length of rawhide from his saddlebag and used it to lash the broken wheel frame out of the way so it would not drag and snag. It was not a real repair, but it would keep the wreckage from blocking the trail for anyone who came after. A coyote darted closer, emboldened by hunger. It was within 30 yards now, its lips pulled back to show yellow teeth. Chayton swung the Henry rifle up in one smooth motion, levered around into the chamber with a metallic snap, and fired a shot into the dirt 10 feet ahead of the animal. The report cracked across the prairie like a whip, and the coyote yelped and bolted. The rest of the pack scattered tails low, vanishing into the shimmering heat. "Hold on tight," Chayton said to Sophia. She pressed her face against his back, her small body trembling, and he felt the fragile weight of her trust settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. He kicked the roan into a steady trot, heading west toward the distant smudge of hills where the town of Sagebrush lay. The bay pony followed on the lead rope, its hooves thumping softly in the dust. As they rode, Sophia's breathing slowed and began to match the rhythm of his own, in and out, steady and deep. Her cheek rested against the rough cotton of his shirt, and he could feel the frantic beat of her heart gradually calming. Behind them, the vultures descended on the wagon, their wings black against the white sky. Chayton did not look back. By the time they reached Sagebrush, the sun had dropped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with bands of orange and purple that faded to deep violet in the east. The first stars were beginning to prick through the gathering darkness, and the air had turned cool enough to raise goosebumps on Sophia's bare arms. Chayton felt her shiver against his back and pulled a worn wool blanket from his saddlebag, draping it over her shoulders without slowing. The town of Sagebrush was not large, barely 200 souls clustered along a single wide street of packed dirt. Timber frame buildings lined both sides, a livery stable at the south end, a mercantile with a false front, a saloon with yellowed windows, a blacksmith's forge dark and silent for the night, and a schoolhouse standing slightly apart at the north end, painted white and glowing faintly in the last light. A thin creek ran along the southern edge of town, its bed mostly dry clay, with only a trickle of water down the center, not enough to sustain the farms that depended on it. Chayton had passed through sagebrush twice before trading horses and information with the townspeople. It was not a wealthy place. Most of the residents were small farmers or laborers. But it had been honest enough. Or it had been before Bartholomew Pike's influence had spread like rot through Greenwood. He rode to the livery stable where a single lantern hung from a hook by the door, casting a weak circle of light. The owner, a man named Bertram, was inside forking hay into a stall. Bertram was in his mid-40s, his shoulders stooped from years of hard labor, his hands thick and calloused. His face was lined with the kind of deep worry that came from bad harvests and debts he could not pay. He looked up as Chayton dismounted, then looked again when he saw Sophia slumped in the saddle. "Found her on the trail," Chayton said before Bertram could ask. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Her mother's dead. Wagon broke down south of the Black Hills near Devil's Ridge." Bertram set down his pitchfork and wiped his hands on his trousers, his expression shifting from surprise to sorrow. "Poor little thing. You taking her to Doc Franklin?" "That's the plan," Chayton said. He lifted Sophia down from the saddle, her legs so weak she could barely stand. He steadied her with one hand on her shoulder. Bertram nodded slowly. "I'll give you some hay for the horses. Won't charge you. Times being what they are, folks gotta help each other." Chayton knew what he meant. The creek that used to run full and strong through town had been diverted at its source upstream near the pump house that belonged to Bartholomew Pike. Pike owned the largest cattle spread in the territory, thousands of acres stretching from Iron Mountain to the Lonesome Trail. And he controlled the water rights with the same iron grip he used on everything else: land-labor politics. The small farmers downstream had watched their fields turn to dust while Pike's pastures stayed green. People did not speak against him openly, but the resentment simmered beneath the surface, like a prairie fire waiting for wind. Chayton traded a strip of dried jerky, tough and salty, made from elk he had shot weeks ago, for a tin cup of milk and a hard biscuit. He handed them to Sophia, who sat on a bale of hay, with the bay pony nuzzling her shoulder. She ate slowly, her eyes distant, and Chayton wondered what she was seeing in her mind. Her mother's face, perhaps, or the endless hours alone on the prairie waiting for help that never came. "You got a name, little one?" Bertram asked gently, crouching down to her level. Sophia swallowed a mouthful of biscuit and looked up at him. "Sophia," she said quietly. "My mama said we were going to live on a farm. She said there would be chickens and a garden. She said I could have a real bed." Bertram's face softened. "Well, Sophia, you're safe now. This man here," he gestured to Chayton, "he's good people. Quiet as a shadow, but good." Chayton did not respond. He was already thinking ahead, the scout's instinct that had kept him alive through ambushes and winter storms and bad water. A dead woman on the trail meant questions. Questions meant involving the law, and the law in Sagebrush was Deputy Dark Dave, a man who worked more for Pike than for justice. But there was also Dr. Franklin, who had principles, and Justice Jules, the circuit judge, who passed through every few weeks. If Chayton could get the right people involved before Pike heard about Sophia, maybe the girl would not end up in the wrong hands. He led Sophia and the horses to Dr. Franklin's house, a narrow building with clapboard siding and a lantern burning in the front window. Franklin answered the door in his shirt sleeves, his sleeves rolled up past his elbows, his hands smelling of carbolic soap. He was in his 50s, gray-haired and steady, the kind of man who had seen enough death to no longer be surprised by it. Got a situation, Chayton said. He explained briefly the wagon, the woman, the girl. Franklin listened without interrupting his eyes, moving to Sophia, who stood beside Chayton with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shroud. Bring the body in tomorrow morning, Franklin said. I'll write a death certificate and arrange for burial. Girl looks dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. She'll need food rest and someone to watch her tonight. I'll take her to the schoolhouse, Chayton said. Charlotte will help. Franklin raised an eyebrow. Charlotte's been asking questions about Pike's dealings, asking where all those orphan trained children have been going. You sure you want to involve her? She's already involved, Chayton said. She just doesn't know it yet. He left the doctor's house and walked Sophia down the dark street to the schoolhouse. The building stood slightly apart from the others, painted white with a pitched roof and a single chimney. Light glowed in the windows, and when Chayton knocked, the doors opened almost immediately. Charlotte stood framed in the doorway, her face lit by lamplight. She was in her mid-20s, a widow who had moved to Sagebrush 2 years ago to teach the children of farmers and ranchers who could spare them from work. She wore a simple gray dress, dusted with chalk, her dark hair pinned back in a no-nonsense bun. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and there was a streak of ink on her left hand. She had a directness about her, a refusal to soften her words for the sake of politeness, and Chayton had always respected that. Her eyes moved from Chayton to Sophia, and her expression shifted immediately from surprise to concern. What happened? Her mother died on the trail, Chayton said. She needs a place to sleep. Charlotte's gaze lingered on Sophia's face. The hollowed eyes, the cracked lips, the way she held herself, as if any sudden movement might shatter her. Without a word, Charlotte stepped aside and gestured them in. The schoolhouse was warm, a pot-bellied stove in the corner radiating heat. Desks lined the room in neat rows, and a blackboard covered one wall still marked with the day's lessons in chalk. Charlotte fetched a tin cup of water from the bucket by the door and a blanket from a trunk near the stove. She set up a narrow cot and tucked Sophia in her movements, gentle and efficient. Then she turned to Chayton, her voice low. Are you bringing trouble to this town? Trouble's already here, Chayton said. I'm just making sure it doesn't reach her. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she nodded. I'll keep her safe. But you better have a plan. Chayton did not answer. He walked to the porch and sat down on the wooden steps, his Henry rifle across his knees. The night was cool and clear, the sky blazing with stars. He could hear the faint trickle of the creek somewhere in the darkness, and the occasional murmur of voices from the saloon down the street. A dog barked once, then fell silent. He kept his breathing slow and his senses alert. If Pike found out about Sophia, he would move fast. Chayton needed to stay one step ahead. Inside the schoolhouse, Charlotte sat at her desk and opened Sophia's carpet bag, which Chayton had left by the door. She pulled out a change of clothes, a faded calico dress, a pair of stockings with holes in the heels, a wooden doll with a cracked porcelain face, and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat on the desk. It was a tag stamped in faded black ink, a pinned placement tag from the Children's Aid Society listing her name, age, and intended placement stop Crow Wing to Sagebrush. Charlotte's breath caught. The orphan train. She had heard of it, a program that sent poor or orphaned children from the crowded cities of the East to rural areas in the West, where they were supposed to be placed with families who would care for them. In practice, it was often little more than a labor market, with children handed over to farmers and ranchers who needed extra hands. Some were treated well, others were not. Folded beneath the tag was a second paper, smaller and grease-stained. Charlotte unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a fraudulent indenture paper masquerading as a placement agreement. Not a proper adoption document, not a church or agency placement form, but a crude receipt written in slanting handwriting. It read, "Received payment of 20 Zuiderbrallers for custody and placement of minor child Sophia age 8 to settle debt for train passage. Signed, B. Pike." Charlotte's hands tightened on the edges of the paper. Her jaw clenched. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at Chayton sitting on the porch, his back straight, his rifle ready. "What have you gotten yourself into?" she murmured. The next morning arrived cold and bright, the sun rising over the flat prairie like a brass coin hammered thin. Chayton had not slept. He had stayed on the schoolhouse porch all night, his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap, watching the street and listening to the sounds of the town, waking roosters, crowing doors, creaking open, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer starting up. Trouble arrived just after dawn. 2 men on horseback rode up the street, their horses' hooves thudding softly in the dust. Chayton recognized them both. The first was Bartholomew Pike, a man in his 50s, tall and lean with a hooked nose and eyes like chips of flint. He wore a wool coat tailored in Denver leather gloves and boots polished to a high shine. He carried himself like a man who owned not just the land, but the sky above it. Behind him rode Deputy Dark Dave, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a scarred face and a tin star pinned to his vest. His revolver, a Colt Army percussion model, hung low on his hip, and his hand rested near it with casual menace. Chayton stood as they approached, his body loose, but ready. He did not reach for his rifle, but he did not move away from it either. Pike reined in his horse and looked down at Chayton with the kind of cold appraisal a butcher might give a steer. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Heard you brought a girl into town last night." Chayton did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, watching Pike's eyes. "She belongs to me," Pike continued. "Her mother signed her over to settle a debt. I have the papers to prove it." The door opened behind Chayton, and Charlotte stepped out onto the porch. Her arms were crossed, her expression hard. "Papers don't make a child property, Mr. Pike." Pike's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile, but his eyes stayed cold. "The law says otherwise, ma'am. The girl was part of an orphan train placement. Her mother couldn't pay for the passage, so she signed a contract. I paid the debt. That makes the girl my responsibility." "Responsibility?" Charlotte said, her voice sharp as a blade. "Is that what you call it when you hide children in your pump house and sell them off to whoever pays the most?" Pike's smile vanished. "Careful, Miss Charlotte. Accusations like that can get a person in trouble." "Then let's take it to the judge." Chayton said, his voice calm and level. "If your papers are legal, you'll get what you're owed. If they're not, the girl stays here." The judge cited territorial guardianship statutes and voided the paper for fraud and coercion, stating that no indenture or placement could lawfully sever a child from their person without a court-reviewed guardianship. Pike's gaze swung back to Chayton, and for a moment the air between them was tight as a drawn bowstring. Then Pike turned his horse. "Fine, we'll see what Justice Jules has to say. But you're wasting your time, boy, and you're making an enemy you don't want." "I'm not your boy," Chayton said evenly. Pike stared at him for a heartbeat longer, then spurred his horse and rode off, Dark Dave following. Dust hung in the air where they had been. Charlotte let out a breath she had been holding. "He's going to come back." "I know," Chayton said. "That's why we're going to get ahead of him." An hour later, they stood in the cramped office of Justice Jules, a narrow room above the mercantile that smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke. Jules was a man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose and a stack of legal books on his desk. He had a reputation for fairness, though he was also practical. he knew that power in the territory did not always flow through legal channels. Dr. Franklin was there as well, along with Pike and Deputy Dark Dave. Sophia sat on a wooden chair by the door, silent and watchful, her small hands folded in her lap. Justice Jules examined the papers. Pike had brought a telegraph message from Crow Wing, matching the fraudulent indenture paper masquerading as a placement agreement Charlotte had found. He frowned as he read, his finger tracing the lines of text. "This is irregular," Jules said finally. "Purchasing a minor outright is illegal under territorial law. Orphan train placements are supposed to go through church agencies or county boards with oversight." "It's a private arrangement," Pike said smoothly. The mother was desperate. She couldn't afford the train passage, and she had no family waiting for her. I helped her out, paid her debt, all legal. "Helped yourself more, like," Charlotte muttered. Jules shot her a warning look, then turned back to Pike. "Do you have proof the mother signed this willingly? Any witnesses?" "She's dead," Pike said flatly. "I can't ask her now, can we?" Chayton leaned forward. "There might be records at the pump house. Pike's men keep ledgers up there, names, payments, placements. If this is how he does business, there'll be more names. More children." Pike's expression hardened. "You accusing me of something?" "Just suggesting we look," Chayton said. Jules tapped his pen on the desk, thinking. "If there's evidence of coercion or fraud, the contract is void. But I need proof. Without it, the law favors the written agreement." He looked at Pike. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning. If no evidence is produced, the girl goes with you." Pike stood straightening his coat. "Then we're done here. I'll be back tomorrow to collect what's mine." He left Dark Dave trailing behind him like a shadow. Charlotte looked at Chayton, her face pale but determined. "So, what now?" "Now we go to the pump house," Chayton said. Word spread quickly through sagebrush. By midday, Pike's hired men were loitering around the telegraph office, and the saloon hands resting on their pistols, eyes tracking anyone who moved too freely. The town felt smaller, tighter, like a noose being pulled inch by inch. People spoke in low voices and avoided eye contact. Chayton spent the afternoon at the mercantile buying basic supplies. With the few coins he had left, flour, salt, pork, a coil of rope matches. The owner, a man named Owen, kept his voice low as he tallied the bill. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, friend." "Hornets were already stirred," Chayton said. Back at the schoolhouse, Chayton worked on the wagon he had brought from the trail. The broken wheel was beyond saving, but he fashioned a simple travois from 2 long poles and a stretched hide lashing it to the remaining axle frame. It would drag instead of roll, but it would move, and that was enough. At dusk, Deputy Dark Dave made his move. He came through the alley behind the schoolhouse, where the light was dim and the shadows long. Charlotte was inside with Sophia, and Chayton was adjusting the travois straps when he heard the scrape of boots on gravel. "Pike wants the girl," Dave said, stepping into view. His hand rested on his revolver. "You can hand her over easy, or I'll take her hard. Your choice." Chayton straightened slowly, his hands loose at his sides. "You don't want to do this, Dave." "Don't tell me what I want." Dave growled and lunged. Chayton sidestepped, grabbed Dave's wrist, and twisted it hard against the edge of a rain barrel. The deputy's revolver clattered to the dirt. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, pulling Sophia back under the porch where the shadows were thickest. Dave swore and swung a wooden club he had pulled from his belt. It caught Chayton across the ribs with a sharp crack that sent white-hot pain flaring up his side. Chayton grunted, but did not go down. He drove his fist into Dave's temple in a controlled strike, and the deputy crumpled to his knees, dazed. A woman's voice called from across the alley. Winifred the seamstress standing in the doorway of her shop. "Pike's getting impatient. You don't have much time." Chayton nodded his thanks and hauled Sophia to her feet. "Cellar," he said to Charlotte. "Take her down and stay quiet." Charlotte led Sophia to the schoolhouse cellar, a dirt-floored storage space beneath the floorboards, accessed through a trapdoor. Chayton followed, then went back to drag Dark Dave out of sight behind a stack of crates. Later, Dr. Franklin came to the schoolhouse and examined Chayton's ribs. "Two cracked," he said, winding strips of torn sheet around Chayton's torso. Charlotte held the bandage steady, her hands firm against his skin. Their faces were close, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Breathe with me," Charlotte said quietly. "In, out, steady." Chayton matched her rhythm, their eyes meeting. He saw concern there and something else, determination. She tied off the bandage and stepped back. "You'll live," Franklin said, "but you need to move carefully. Another blow like that could puncture a lung." "We're leaving tonight," Chayton said. They left Sagebrush under cover of darkness, the moon a thin crescent, barely bright enough to light the trail. Chayton led the way on the roan, Sophia sitting in front of him, wrapped in a blanket, her small body pressed against his chest. Charlotte followed on the bay pony with the travois dragging behind laden with supplies. The night air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The first wolf howl came an hour into the ride, a long, mournful sound that rose and fell like wind through a canyon. Sophia's hands tightened on the saddle horn. Chayton leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "They won't come close. Wolves fear fire and men. We're both." "We don't have a fire," Sophia whispered. "Then they'll fear me," Chayton said. Dry lightning flickered on the horizon, bright and silent, illuminating the distant peaks of Iron Mountain in stark relief. The roan spooked twice at shadows, its ears swiveling nervously. But Sophia whispered to it soft, wordless sounds and stroked its neck, and the horse calmed. They reached the river ford just before midnight. The water was low, barely knee-deep, but the current was swift enough to tug at the horse's legs. Chayton was halfway across when the first shot rang out. The bullet whined past his head and struck a cottonwood tree on the far bank, sending bark flying. Chayton yanked the roan around, shielding Sophia with his body, and fired two quick shots from the Henry rifle toward the muzzle flash in the trees. A man cursed, and there was the sound of thrashing in the underbrush. "Into the trees," Chayton shouted. "Move!" They plunged into the cottonwoods on the far bank branches, whipping at their faces. Charlotte ducked low over the bay pony's neck, her dress snagging on thorns. More shots followed, the reports echoing off the water. A bullet struck a rock near Charlotte's head and ricocheted with a sharp whine. Chayton dismounted, pulling Sophia down with him, and found cover behind a fallen log. Charlotte slid off the bay pony and crawled over her, breathing ragged. The horses milled nervously, their eyes rolling white. "You ever shoot a rifle?" Chayton asked, handing her the Spencer carbine he had taken from the wagon supplies. It was an older model, 7 shots in a tube magazine, reliable but heavy. "No," Charlotte said. Chayton showed her quickly how to load, how to work the lever, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. His hands covered hers, guiding her fingers. "On my signal, you fire into the saddle, not the man. Scare them. Don't kill unless you have to." Charlotte's breathing was steady now, her jaw set. She nodded. Chayton whistled sharply, a high piercing note. One of Pike's riders turned his horse toward the sound, silhouetted against the faint glow of the horizon. Charlotte fired. The bullet hit the saddle horn with a metallic clang, and the rider yelped and tumbled sideways into the creek with a splash. The others hesitated, then retreated, their horses crashing away through the brush. "Move," Chayton said, "before they regroup." They rode hard through the night, finally reaching a Lakota camp near the base of Iron Mountain as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky. The camp was small, 4 hide lodges arranged in a loose circle around a fire pit, with horses tethered under the pines. Smoke rose in thin blue threads from the lodges. Chayton had scouted for the army years ago, and some of the men here remembered him. They came out to greet him wary at first, then warmer when they saw Sophia and realized he was not bringing soldiers. An elder woman named Auntie Quana emerged from one of the lodges. She was in her 60s, her face weathered and kind, her arms still strong from years of hauling water and tanning hides. She took one look at Sophia's blistered feet and nodded. "Bring her," Quana said in Lakota, then switched to English for Charlotte's benefit. "She needs care." Inside the lodge, Quana washed Sophia's feet in warm water, wrapped them in soft deer hide, and gave her a bowl of corn mush and willow bark tea. Sophia's eyes drooped, and she fell asleep almost instantly, curled up on a pile of furs. By the fire, Chayton spoke with Ten Bears, a man in his 40s who had once scouted alongside him. Ten Bears listened without interrupting, his face impassive, then spat into the dirt. "Pike hides girls at the pump house," Ten Bears said. "Keeps them there until he can place them. Ledgers too, names, payments, everything. He thinks no one will touch it because it's on his land." "Where exactly?" Chayton asked. "North Fork of the creek, timber building by the spring, locked but not guarded at night. He's arrogant." Charlotte, sitting nearby with a cup of coffee, looked up. "We need those ledgers." Chayton nodded. "We do." They rode to the pump house at dawn, when the light was still soft and uncertain. The building sat in a narrow valley where the creek began, water flowing from a spring beneath the hillside. The structure was built of rough-hewn timber, half buried in the slope, with a single heavy door, padlocked shut. A wooden sluice carried water downhill toward Pike's ranch, diverting it away from the small farms downstream. Charlotte dismounted and pulled a hat pin from her hair. "Hold this," she said, handing Chayton her Spencer rifle. She crouched by the lock, her hand steady despite the risk, and worked the pin into the mechanism. The lock was simple, old, and corroded, and after a minute, it clicked open. Chayton pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. Inside, the air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and rust. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with tools, coils of rope, burlap sacks of grain. A desk stood in the corner, covered with papers. Chayton lit a match and held it up. The first ledger was right there on top, a simple bound book with a leather cover. He flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with each entry. Names, dates, payments. Each line listed a child's name, an origin town, and a sum of money, along with initials that matched telegraph records. It was all there, proof of illegal placements disguised as orphan train adoptions. A second book detailed Pike's water diversions, showing exactly how much water he had stolen from the farms downstream and how much money he had made from it. Then Chayton saw the wooden chest. It was half hidden under a canvas tarp, in the corner ropes tied around it. He pulled the tarp back and used his knife to cut the ropes, then pried open the lid. Inside were 3 children. They were alive, bound at the wrists, with rough twine gagged with strips of cloth, huddled together in the narrow, dark space. A boy, about 9 years old, with dark hair and frightened eyes. 2 girls, younger one, blonde one with brown braids. They blinked in the sudden light, shrinking back. Charlotte gasped. "Oh, dear heavens." Chayton cut the ropes and pulled the gags free. The boy coughed and whispered hoarsely, "Trinidad." He pointed to the girls. "Ilsa, Nicolette." One of the girls, Ilsa, had an A-pinned placement tag from the Children's Aid Society listing her name, age, and intended placement stop pinned to her dress, just like Sophia's. But there was something else. A dark stain on her sleeve. Blood. Chayton lifted her arm gently. She whimpered. A deep gash ran along her forearm, infected and oozing. Someone had hurt her, and no one had cared for it. "We need to get her to Dr. Franklin," Charlotte said urgently. "Can you walk?" Chayton asked the children. They nodded, though their legs shook. Charlotte wrapped them in blankets from the shelves. Chayton picked up Ilsa, cradling her carefully. She was light as a bird, her skin hot with fever. "We can't take horses with 4 children and 1 injured," Charlotte said. "Pike's men will run us down." Chayton studied the map on the wall, a rough sketch of the territory. He traced a line with his finger. "There's a coulee that runs north to Outlaw Pass. Steep ground, narrow. Horses can't follow easily. We go on foot." Charlotte met his eyes. "You sure?" "No," Chayton said honestly, "but it's the only way." Sophia, who had been silent up to now, suddenly spoke. "Mama told me once, she said there was a place with water, a spring. She said it was ours." Her voice was small, confused. "She said we'd be safe there." Chayton and Charlotte exchanged a glance. A spring. The pump house. Was it possible Sophia's mother had known about this place? There was no time to think about it now. They had to move. They moved through the coulee, a dry ravine choked with juniper and sharp rocks. The children walked in single file, wrapped in saddle blankets. Chayton carried Ilsa, her head lolling against his shoulder, her breathing shallow. Charlotte brought up the rear, the Spencer rifle slung over her shoulder, the horses following on lead ropes. Behind them, Pike's men followed on foot, rifles raised. A shot cracked and splinters flew from a rock near Chayton's head. Another shot clipped the roan's ear, drawing blood. The horse reared and Sophia screamed. Chayton caught her by the waist, pulling her tight against his side despite the sharp, lancing pain in his cracked ribs. He set her down and pushed her forward. "Keep moving, don't stop." The coulee narrowed into a slot canyon, the walls rising steep and close on both sides. The sky above was darkening, thick clouds boiling up from the west. The first drops of rain began to fall hard, cold drops that hit like pebbles. Then the thunder came. Not overhead, but upstream. A low growing roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. "Flash flood," Charlotte shouted. Chayton saw it, a wall of brown water surging down the canyon, carrying branches and rocks and everything in its path. "Climb now." He threw Ilsa up onto a high ledge, her small body limp. Then he grabbed Nicolette and boosted her up. Trinidad scrambled up on his own. Charlotte grabbed Sophia and pushed her upward, then turned to help Chayton. The water hit him like a fist, cold and brutal, shoving him sideways. He wedged his boot into a crack in the rock and shoved Sophia higher. Charlotte reached down her hand, closing around his forearm. He felt the desperate strength in her grip, the tendons in her wrist standing out. "Hold on," she screamed. Chayton kicked against the rock muscles burning and scrambled up onto the ledge. They collapsed together, breathing hard faces, inches apart, water streaming off their clothes. The flood roared past below, a churning mass of brown water and debris. It swept away the travois, the spare food, the main ledger. When it finally passed, the canyon floor was a muddy ruin. Chayton checked his pockets. The telegraph stub and Sophia's fraudulent indenture paper, masquerading as a placement agreement, were still there, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into Charlotte's bodice. The children were safe, but most of the evidence was gone. "We still have them," Charlotte said, nodding to the children. "They're witnesses." Chayton nodded. "Then we'd better keep them alive." The climb to Outlaw Pass took the rest of the day. By dusk, they reached the narrow gap between 2 ridges of black basalt rock. The wind howled through the pass, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder, and something else, fear maybe, or just exhaustion. Pike's men arrived at the entrance just as the sun set their silhouettes black against the dying light. Chayton and Charlotte took positions behind the rocks, returning fire. The children huddled behind them, silent and terrified. Then Bertram appeared riding a mule and carrying his old Winchester .73 rifle. "Figured you might need help," he said, dismounting. His face was set hard. He had lost his farm to Pike's water theft. This was personal now. Bertram fired twice, and one of Pike's riders cursed and dropped his rifle. Dr. Franklin followed on another mule, his medical bag bouncing on his saddle. "I'm not letting you all die out here." A bullet caught Bertram in the forearm, punching through muscle and bone. He grunted and fell back, blood streaming. Franklin dragged him behind a boulder and tore open his bag, applying pressure to the wound with strips of cloth. "We need to cross the trestle," Chayton said, pointing to the old rail bridge that spanned a dry ravine ahead. It was a relic from a long-abandoned mining operation, the wood gray and rotting. Charlotte nodded. They moved quickly, testing the planks. One cracked under Charlotte's weight with a sharp snap, and she dropped to one knee, her arms shooting out to catch Sophia across her legs. She pulled her back with a strained effort, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. Chayton crawled ahead, testing each board with his hands, using his body to bridge the weak spots. The children crossed one by one, their eyes wide with terror, their small hands gripping the rails. On the far side, 10 bears and 2 Lakota braves appeared silently, moving through the shadows like ghosts. "We heard the shots," 10 bears said. Chayton explained the lost ledger. 10 bears nodded grimly. "Then we take Pike himself. He's the evidence now." They pushed back down the canyon toward the pump house. The rain came harder now, turning the creek into a torrent. Chayton threw a rock to lure out a guard, and the man stepped into view. Charlotte hid behind a barrel, reloaded the Spencer rifle with calm, practiced movements, and passed it to Chayton. Their hands brushed, and he felt her pulse steady and strong, despite everything. On 10 Bears' signal, Chayton kicked in the door low, while 10 Bears attacked high. Gunfire filled the small space, deafening. Pike ducked behind the desk, then lunged forward and grabbed Sophia, yanking her by the hair. She cried out, and he pressed his percussion pistol to her head. "Back off," Pike shouted, his voice cracking. "I'll kill her." Chayton froze his ribs, screaming with pain. He kept his voice calm, his eyes locked on Pike's. "That cap's wet from the rain. It won't fire." Pike's eyes narrowed. "You willing to bet her life on that?" He cocked the pistol. The hammer fell. The cap fizzled and failed, producing only a weak spark. Chayton lunged in that instant, slamming his forearm into Pike's wrist with all his weight. Bone cracked. Pike screamed, and the pistol fell. 10 Bears subdued Deputy Dark Dave, pinning him to the floor with a knee on his back. Charlotte pulled Sophia away, wrapping her in her arms. Sophia clung tight, shaking violently, but slowly calming, as she saw Chayton safe. A bullet from outside one of Pike's last men caught Chayton in the shoulder, spinning him around. He went down, hard blood spreading across his shirt. Charlotte screamed. She grabbed the Spencer rifle, levered around, and fired through the doorway. The shot was clean, precise. The man fell. She dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside Chayton. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely, pressing her hands to the wound. "Don't you dare leave us." Chayton's vision swam, but he managed a faint smile. Not planning on it. Dr. Franklin and Justice Jules arrived on mules, drenched but determined, flanked by townsfolk Winifred Owen, others quiet but resolute. Pike and Dark Dave were bound with ropes, their hands tied behind their backs. Franklin worked on Chayton's shoulder by lantern light, digging out the bullet with forceps and stitching the wound with practiced efficiency. Chayton gritted his teeth, but did not cry out. Charlotte held his hand the entire time, her grip tight enough to leave marks. Charlotte settled the rescued children by the stove, giving them hot tea and blankets. 10 bears found a key that Dark Dave had dropped during the fight and used a hatchet to pry open a false panel in the back wall. Inside was a second ledger, sealed in wax to stay dry. It matched the first name's payments, telegraph receipts. Proof. Justice Jules read it aloud, his voice firm and clear. This is sufficient evidence of coercion and fraud. The contracts are void. Bertram, his arm bandaged, stared at the pipe valves that diverted the creek. Chayton, his shoulder throbbing, loosened a stuck valve wheel, then stepped back. Bertram turned it fully, his face set with grim satisfaction. The water hissed and then flowed freely, heading back toward the small farms downstream. The rain stopped. The clouds parted. Stars appeared. Resolution and final surprise. The court hearing was held under the schoolhouse eaves 3 days later, when Chayton could stand without swaying. The ledger pages, telegraph stubs, fraudulent indenture paper masquerading as a placement agreement. And testimonies from Charlotte, the children, and others were presented. Justice Jules read each document carefully, then rendered his decision. Pike and Dark Dave were shackled and sent by Wagon to Crow Wing for trial on charges of child coercion, water theft, and attempted murder. The townsfolk watched them go in silence. 10 bears and his braves left quietly for the hills, declining thanks. "We did what was right," 10 bears said simply. Sophia stood by the repaired wagon, now clean and whole. She took Chayton's hand, his good hand, and looked up at him. "You said you'd be my father." Chayton glanced at Charlotte, who stood beside him. He nodded slowly. "I did." Charlotte met his gaze. "She'll need 2 parents. A child needs stability, a home." Chayton exhaled slowly, touched his healing shoulder with a small, pained grin. "I might need help with the heavy lifting." Charlotte stepped closer, her hand brushing his. Then it settled. Then Justice Jules cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." He held up a paper yellowed and creased found in the pump house files. A land deed, filed 8 years ago by a woman named Maria Reyes, cook at the pump house for 1 season. The deed conveys a homestead claim on this spring-fed lot to Sophia Reyes Minor, to be held in trust. Witnessed by Dr. Franklin. Franklin nodded. "I remember her. Good woman. She wanted her daughter to have something." The deed was legal. The land was Sophia's. At dusk they walked to the spring. Clean water flowed over smooth rocks. A meadowlark called from a nearby tree, its song bright and clear. Chayton lifted Sophia carefully onto the roan, his shoulder protesting. Charlotte steadied her from the other side. They stood together facing the plot of land, small but theirs. "Home," Charlotte said. "Home," Chayton echoed. Sophia squeezed both their hands. "Let's build it." Over the next weeks they did. Chayton and Bertram and the other men raised a simple cabin from logs cut in the hills. Charlotte taught Sophia and the other children to read and write their lessons conducted under the cottonwood tree by the spring. Trinidad, Ilsa, and Nicolette were placed with families in town. Real families this time, people who wanted children, not labor. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky gold and pink, Chayton and Charlotte stood side by side watching Sophia play with the bay pony. "Will you marry me?" Chayton asked quietly. "Proper, I mean. With the judge and everything." Charlotte looked at him, a small smile on her lips. "I thought you'd never ask." They were married the following Sunday in the schoolhouse, with the whole town in attendance. Sophia stood between them, holding both their hands, her face glowing with a happiness that had once seemed impossible. And when the ceremony was done, they walked together back to the spring, to the small cabin, to the home they had built from dust and water, and something stronger than either a promise kept a family forged, a future earned.